My name is Audrey Bennett. I was 29 that spring, and I walked into my brother Owen's wedding knowing I had already paid for my place there with years nobody saw. I had not come for gratitude. Not for speeches. Not for anyone to finally call me noble under warm lights and expensive flowers after a life built mostly in silence. I came because Owen had asked me to be there, and because I wanted one clean night where the boy I helped raise could begin his life without apology. The reception sat high over Manhattan. All glass, candlelight, and polished voices. The kind of room where every surface looked soft until you imagined falling against it. I wore the best navy dress I could afford, pressed twice in my apartment bathroom, and carried myself carefully because dignity can look expensive when you hold it straight enough. For a few minutes, I let myself believe the night might stay kind, that love had made enough space for me to enter it without being measured. Then I reached my table and found a small folded note tucked beneath my place card. Neat as a favor. Light enough to miss unless your fingers knew caution. It read, "Turn it over before you sit." And something in me went cold because cruelty usually announces itself exactly 1 second before it lands. I flipped the card and found the words "the groom's uneducated dependent" written in clean black script. Elegant enough to make the insult look practiced. The laugh came from my left first, then another behind me, then 3 more. Easy and social. The kind people use when they think the right person is being cut down. I kept holding the card because dropping it would have looked like weakness, and I had spent too many years surviving on less than respect to waste any now. Before I could step back, Owen was beside me, his hand around my wrist, his chair scraping hard across the floor as he looked at the room and said, "Whoever did this is about to learn what disrespect costs." That was when Grant Sutton rose from his table with the calm of a man who had mistaken money for authority for so long it had become his natural posture. He adjusted his cuff, looked at the card in my hand, and gave the room a thin smile that made several people relax too early. Then he looked straight at Owen and offered, "Sit down." This was a joke. But even before the silence hit, I knew nobody had spent that much money trying to be funny. Owen did not let go of my wrist, and the pressure of his hand kept me steady while the laughter thinned into the nervous silence wealthy people wear when cruelty stops feeling protected. Grant Sutton kept his small smile, as if the room still belonged to him, and told Owen not to confuse hospitality with offense because some jokes only sound harsh when people bring old insecurities to beautiful evenings. I looked around and saw exactly what mattered in that moment. Not one person reaching for the card. Not one person pretending they had missed it. Only polished faces waiting to see whether money or loyalty would speak louder. Before Owen could move, Sadie Sutton crossed the floor in her white silk dress, stopped beside us, and looked from my hand to her father with a stillness that felt more dangerous than panic. She asked who approved the place cards. And Grant dismissed the question with a shrug, so slight it looked rehearsed, then added that adults should know the difference between malice and poor taste before they ruin their own celebration. That was the first moment I understood this had not been arranged for my humiliation alone. Because he was not protecting a mistake. He was testing whether the man his daughter married would defend the woman who had made him possible. Owen turned fully toward him and gave the room the part nobody there had earned, telling them I worked nights in a hospital basement cleaning surgical trays while he finished school, and that every decent thing in his life had my fingerprints on it. A few people looked down then, but not because conscience had arrived. Only because hearing sacrifice stated plainly made the insult on the card sound uglier than they had intended to enjoy. Sadie kept staring at her father, and when she asked whether he had known about this in advance, he did not answer quickly enough to help himself. He reached for his phone instead, angled his body away, and spoke low without stepping far enough to hide the words attorney, hold, and transfer. Each one clean enough to cut through music and glass. Owen heard it too, and so did I. And when Grant added that certain employment discussions should be reconsidered until emotions settled, the room changed from cruel to transactional right in front of me. I had known rich people could wound with manners, But hearing him reach for my brother's future with one call made the place card feel smaller, almost childish. Beside the machinery he actually trusted. Sadie went pale, then steadied, and asked whether this was what her marriage meant to him. A contract managed from outside the vows, with accounts reviewed, decisions screened, and love allowed only if it stayed grateful. Grant finally put the phone down and told her protection was not control, that Owen had talent, but no instinct for scale, and that families like ours confused sacrifice with authority because hardship made ordinary people sentimental about their own endurance. I felt Owen start to step forward, but I touched his sleeve and kept him where he was, because by then the danger was no longer a scene at a wedding. It was the proof in front of me that Grant Sutton had no intention of forgiving defiance, only pricing it. At 6:08 the next morning, Owen called before I had even finished pouring coffee, and I knew from the silence on the line that Grant had done exactly what men like him always do after being publicly denied. Owen told me the clinic had withdrawn the offer before sunrise, all warmth gone from the original email, and that some vague language about changing business conditions now sat where his future had been 12 hours earlier. I stood in my kitchen holding a mug I never lifted, looking at the chipped white rim while he kept breathing into the phone, and the humiliation from the wedding gave way to something colder and far more deliberate. An hour later, the second message arrived, and this one hit a different part of me because it carried the kind of damage pride alone could never justify. The nonprofit partner reviewing my weekend reading room proposal sent a careful note explaining that a private funding path had unexpectedly closed, and the project would need to be postponed, pending new support. I read that sentence 3 times, not because I misunderstood it, but because the room I had imagined for children in Queens, shelves, folding tables, donated books, had just been touched by the same hand that wrote dependent on my place card. Sadie came to my apartment before noon, wearing yesterday's jeans, and none of the polish that had covered her like a second skin at the wedding. And for the first time, she looked like someone standing in her own life without furniture around her. She stepped into my kitchen, took in the narrow counters, the thrifted chairs, the stack of grant folders near the window, and told me her father had frozen the apartment transfer and cut off access to the trust before breakfast. Owen was already there, pacing so hard the floor sounded tired beneath him, and when Sadie put her phone on my table, neither of them needed to explain that whatever came next had already moved past family embarrassment. The first video had been sent by Megan Sutton, Sadie's cousin, who had been at a private dinner before the reception and recorded more than anyone there expected would ever matter. Grant sat with a whiskey glass in one hand, smiling the way men smile when they believe privacy has made honesty safe, and called me a sentimental leash that needed to be cut if Owen was ever going to learn obedience. The second clip was shorter and uglier, Grant leaning back in his chair and dismissing poor people's sacrifices as failure retold with better language. And by the time it ended, nobody in my kitchen looked shocked anymore. Owen wanted the clips online immediately, his voice already moving toward exposure, toward damage, toward the kind of release anger mistakes for completion when the wound is still fresh. Sadie agreed at first, not because she craved scandal, but because watching her father speak without disguise had finally stripped the word protection out of everything he had ever called love. I turned the phone face down and told them not yet, because a private video could be called bitterness, but a calm invitation to reconcile could become something stronger if Grant chose, in his own house and with full confidence, to speak exactly like himself again. That was the moment the plan took shape, not as revenge dressed up as strategy, but as a refusal to let power keep hiding behind manners and edited memory. I told Sadie to ask for one family meeting, respectful, direct, and impossible for Grant to resist, because men who lose control in public will always demand one more room where they think they can recover it. Owen stopped pacing then. Sadie nodded without looking away, and when I opened my desk drawer and set my recorder on the table, All three of us understood we were done bringing pain into rooms without evidence. 3 days later, we drove to the Sutton townhouse under a gray Manhattan sky that made every stone facade look harder. And I understood why men like Grant preferred homes that felt expensive before they felt inhabited. I wore a navy blouse, black slacks, and the silver ring I had bought myself after Owen finished school. Nothing dramatic. Nothing chosen to impress people who had already decided what counted. In my bag sat the recorder from my desk drawer. And before we stepped inside, I touched it once just to remind myself that calm mattered more than anger when the truth finally got a table of its own. Diane Sutton met us in the formal sitting room with the careful face of a woman who had spent years calling control elegance, then asked if we could please keep this civil, as though civility had been the missing piece. Grant was already seated near the window, one leg crossed over the other, and when his eyes moved from Sadie to Owen to me, he gave the same thin smile he had worn at the wedding. He told us he had agreed to this meeting out of respect for his daughter's distress, not because he intended to validate theatrics from people who mistook offense for injury. I sat across from him and put the facts in the room without decoration. The place card, Owen's vanished job offer, and the reading room funding that collapsed the morning after I challenged him in public. Grant listened without interruption, then told me the card had been a social misjudgment inflated by insecurity, and that business decisions made after emotional displays were not evidence of malice, but signs of prudent leadership. The word prudent sat there between us, like an insult dressed for court, and when Owen leaned forward to call it what it was, Grant barely looked at him before suggesting maturity often arrives later in men raised by sisters instead of equals. Sadie went still beside him, not stunned anymore, only stripped of the last comfort of believing her father might back away if given one private chance. She asked whether he had interfered with Owen's employment because he defended me, and Grant told her he had acted because loyalty without discernment becomes liability once marriage enters rooms where reputation carries financial consequences. I watched Diane close her eyes for one brief second at that line, not out of surprise, but the tired recognition of someone hearing a script she had excused too many times to keep the walls intact. When I asked about the reading room, Grant looked at me directly and gave me the clearest contempt he had shown since this began, telling me private money was not obligated to subsidize every earnest project attached to a wounded biography. He went further then, because power makes men careless once they feel familiar enough with a room, and told Owen talent was real but background still shaped judgment, while people like me dragged old hunger into new spaces and mistook endurance for authority. Sadie turned toward him slowly and asked the question that finally removed every layer left between truth and inheritance. If she stayed with Owen after this, would he cut her off completely? Grant did not hesitate that time, and the speed of his answer made the room feel smaller than it had a second earlier. He told her yes. The apartment transfer would remain frozen. The trust would remain closed, and any support attached to his name would end the moment she chose to stand against her own family in favor of manufactured grievance. Diane whispered Sadie's name like a plea that had arrived years too late. But Sadie never looked away from him, and I understood then that this was the false victory we had come for. The moment truth surfaced cleanly while still costing everything, I reached into my bag, placed my phone on the table, and let the first video play into the silence he had just built with his own mouth. Grant's recorded voice filled the room, calling me a sentimental leash and reducing Owen's life to obedience management. And before anyone could recover, I played the second clip where he dismissed sacrifice as failure, retold in cleaner language. His face changed then, not into shame, because shame requires an intact conscience, but into the cold alertness of a man, realizing the room he meant to control had already moved beyond him. He stepped toward me and asked where I got the recordings. Yet the question only confirmed what mattered. Not that he denied the words, but that exposure frightened him more than having spoken them. Owen did not rise. Sadie did not cry. And Diane looked at her husband as though some private debt had finally come due in full. I stood, took my phone, and left the rest of his performance untouched on the table. Because by then, we had everything we came for: proof, choice, and the clean, irreversible sound of a daughter understanding exactly what her father valued most. We did not post that night because I wanted the truth arranged cleanly before anyone tried to call it grief, bitterness, or a poor family's resentment toward a rich one. By morning, I uploaded the place card, the 2 recordings, and a short statement that stayed close to facts. My brother's wedding, the insult, the withdrawn job offer, the reading room funding that vanished, and the private meeting where Grant Sutton chose threat over remorse. Owen read every line before I hit publish. Sadie approved every word that named her father. And once it was live, none of us touched it again, because facts do not grow stronger when panic keeps editing them. The first wave came from strangers who understood the place card immediately. Not as a joke, not as bad manners, but as a social ranking written in expensive ink. The second wave came when people heard Grant's own voice and realized the cruelty was not impulsive. Because men do not accidentally describe a woman as a leash or a neighborhood project as disposable. By midday, the story had moved beyond sympathy and into recognition. Teachers sharing the reading room post, former employees posting about fear, donors forwarding the clips with the kind of silence that means doors are already closing elsewhere. Grant's company issued a short statement before the end of the day, announcing that he was stepping back pending an internal review, and the careful language only made the collapse look more real. A charity board removed his name from an upcoming gala. 2 investment partners paused discussions, and the polished network that had protected him for decades began creating distance with the speed only reputation panic can buy. He had spent years teaching people that proximity to him meant security. And now, the same people were proving the opposite by moving first, quietly, before his damage reached their own names. Owen did not get his original position back, which made the week feel truer than any neat ending would have. But a former clinical supervisor reached out after seeing the post and asked him to come in anyway. Sadie moved out before the weekend was over, carrying 2 suitcases and none of the things her father had once promised would make her future easier. And Diane stayed in the townhouse only long enough to understand silence could not keep passing for elegance. The reading room changed fastest of all, because once the clip spread, small donations began arriving from teachers, parents, nurses, and people I would never meet. Each note saying some version of the same thing: build it anyway. I read those messages at my kitchen table after midnight while the city kept moving outside. And for the first time since the wedding, my body stopped bracing for the next blow. What Grant had tried to bury through private influence returned in public through trust. Not from people rescuing me, but from people recognizing exactly what he had tried to diminish. Owen sat across from me in that thin apartment light, Sadie beside him, and when neither of them reached for the screen or for me, I understood the real shift had already happened. We were no longer asking power to let us belong. 3 months later, the reading room opened inside a borrowed nonprofit space in Queens. Smaller than my first proposal, but real enough to smell like paper, dust, and second chances. We had mismatched shelves, folding chairs, donated novels, and a volunteer sign-in sheet taped beside the door. And none of it looked diminished to me anymore. Owen stopped apologizing with his eyes every time he looked at me, and that change mattered more than any public fallout because gratitude had finally learned how to stand without leaning. Sadie built a quieter life with him downtown, far from her father's maps, and Diane left the townhouse soon after, carrying the sort of silence that only arrives after years of choosing wrong. I did not spend much time measuring what Grant Sutton had lost, because by then my own life no longer felt arranged around his opinion or anyone else's permission. The children who came on Saturdays did not know anything about place cards, trust funds, or social rankings, and watching them choose books reminded me how little cruelty can survive when it is denied an audience. One rainy afternoon, Grant appeared outside my apartment alone. No driver. No assistant. No polished distance. Just a man standing under weather he could not instruct away. He told me I was wrong, and the words sounded bare enough to be true. But truth arriving late is not the same thing as repair. I left him in the hallway and told him he had confused kindness with weakness, money with worth, and obedience with love. Then closed the door without anger because healing had given me something revenge never could. A life that no longer needed him to understand it. If this story stayed with you, thank you for being here with me. I hope anyone who has been underestimated finds real love, steady peace, and a life that no longer bends for cruelty. Stay close, and keep choosing what is honest, gentle, and yours when the world gets loud.